Then I will introduce our speaker in a moment. Housekeeping matters first. As I said a few moments ago, please make sure your microphone is muted. Again, you'll see the little red hash mark through the mic symbol. There'll be time for questions at the end, and we've got the chat option available, and we are pretty faithful about getting those questions answered. We are taping tonight's program, and it will be posted in fairly short order on the website, the nativeorchidconference.org. If you haven't visited the site recently, all previous programs, including Peter Zale's program from last month, are available to be watched at your convenience. So keep that in mind if you're tired of shoveling snow or going through garden catalogs, you can go visit some orchid programs visually. Having said that, I'd like to introduce tonight's guest. I know Jon as a writer, photographer, and tour leader, who's currently giving tonight's program from his home in the Shetland Islands. Is that right, Jon? Where I think the
Yeah,
time
that's correct.
difference is like what he's talking to us at 1:30 in the morning, his time, with a cup of strong coffee at the ready, I think. The premise for this program started in 2018 when he wrote the book Orchid Summer, which was the story of his journey seeking and finding native orchids in the British Isles. And that's the subject of tonight's program. So he's going to share that search with us. So, having said that, Jon, please go ahead, share your screen, and floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jan. I hope can you confirm that you can see my screen there?
It looks good. Yes.
Excellent. Right. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for that warm welcome, Jan. Um, I think by way of introduction, I'll take you back to the early 1980s and oh, this is not working. Why is that not working? No, I'm so sorry. My screen is not. Right. I think it's working. Take you back to the 1980s. And when I was growing up in the rural southwest of England, um, we lived in the middle of nowhere in an area called the Somerset Levels, which is one of the flatter, wetter parts of the southwest of England. We lived in a little village on top of a hill, and there weren't really any other kids my age. And I was absolutely obsessed with natural history. And so the lack of friends didn't really bother me. I would just take myself off into the countryside to look for wildlife of all kinds. And when I wasn't looking for wildlife, I was no trouble to my mum and dad. I just immersed myself in books. And a few years ago, my mum gave me a box of my childhood books. And I realized that I was predestined from a very young age to become an orchid hunter. A lot of the books which I was reading at the time were all to do with looking for wildlife all around the world. Some of you may be familiar with the late Gerald Durrell, who was a British-born naturalist. He was kind of a contemporary, if you will, of Attenborough. And Durrell wrote a book called My Family and Other Animals, all about his childhood growing up on the Greek island of Corfu. And I basically wanted to be Jared Durrell. That was my life ambition. Unfortunately, my mum and dad didn't live on a Greek island. And so I had to travel virtually in books. Um, and we didn't have much of a reference library to fulfill my needs to identify what I was finding in the countryside. We've had three books. The Observer's Book of British Wildflowers, which you can see here on the screen, and its equivalents for butterflies and for birds. Um, Obviously, this is it's a tiny little book, and in terms of orchids, when I read through the book, it named I think 5 or 6 different species as present in Britain. And for me, as a 9 or 10-year-old boy, this was an eye opener because the books which I'd been reading about plant hunting all over the world suggested that orchids were only found in exotic destinations, um, hot. and dangerous places in which to travel, which was probably part of why I found these books so enthralling. And there was usually some peril involved trying to see orchids, which perhaps some of us can relate to. According to my books, the orchid hunter had to contend with dangerous wild animals like tigers and crocodiles, um, tropical diseases, and in the case of the Biggles books, which haven't aged terribly well, usually sinister Germans wearing black leather trench coats. I should add that some of my best orchid hunting friends these days are German, and they were rather stereotyped by Captain W.E. Johns in the Biggles books. But the point of all of this is that the Observer's Book of British Wildflowers told me there were orchids in the British countryside, and nothing else would do as a child but to see them. And when the day came, it was this particular species, which is early purple orchid, Orchis mascula. It's one of the first of the British orchids to flower. And my mum and dad did what they always did on a Sunday. They took us for a walk after Sunday lunch, which was absolutely my worst idea of going into the countryside because it's very tame. I wasn't allowed to go and rummage around and look for things. I had to follow my mum and dad along the country lanes, and it was a walk that was all about distance rather than wildlife. And we were heading back home up onto this village on the top of the hill. And I was probably being a bit of a brat, rather a reluctant child being dragged along behind my mum and dad. And I saw this plant, this flower on the bank to the side of the little road we were walking up, and it was purple. And it was unlike any wildflower I'd ever seen before. And I'd looked at it at this plate in the book so many times. I knew what it was, or rather, I knew what I thought it was. So I scrambled up the bank and dropped to my knees, and there was my first orchid. It was indeed an early purple orchid. Um, Now, to me, this seemed like the most incredible thing. It was obviously the rarest plant in Britain, clearly, because it was an orchid. Little did I know that actually this is one of the most widespread of all the British orchids, and it's probably statistically the one I was most likely to bump into as my first ever. Um, it's found all across Britain, from the south of England right the way up to where I live here in Shetland, which is, well, Shetland. Where am I? To give you some context for anyone who's not familiar with the Shetland Islands, it's at 60 degrees north. It's the same line of latitude as Anchorage in Alaska. So this is a tough orchid. Now, the two examples here on the screen, the one on the left is in very typical habitat that's found in an English bluebell woodland, and they're pretty tall plants. English bluebells and early purple orchids are a good, I don't know, 12 inches tall in a woodland setting. The one on the right-hand side, though, that's a Shetland early purple orchid. It's growing on a serpentine fell field, which just goes to show what tough cookies these things are. They're happy in a woodland, they're happy in coastal grassland, but they're even happy on the most inhospitable location in Shetland, which is a pretty inhospitable place for a plant. Serpentine Fellfield is on a hill called the Keen of Hamar on the most northerly island in Shetland on Unst. And the plants there are dwarfed. As you can see, the flower is sorry, the plant is barely taller than the flower head itself. Um, so it's a really tough thing. Um, which then brings us to 10 years ago. I've seen people doing a lot of this recently on social media, say, what were you doing 10 years ago in 2016? Well, by then I had grown up, left home, and I was living up here in Shetland. And I conceived this grand idea to set out to try to see all of Britain and Ireland's orchids in the space of one flowering season. This was the premise for writing the book, which became Orchid Summer. A bit of an artificial construct because people had presumably done this before, but nobody had written a book about it. And it gave me the excuse to spend my every weekend traveling all over Britain and Ireland to some very cool places to see all of the different species of orchid, 50-ish thereabouts, depending on your taxonomic point of view. and to meet people involved with those orchids and the places in which they were to be found, but also to tell colourful stories from the past about the orchids and the people involved with them in the past as well as the present. Um, to give you some context about how good these stories were, the first thing I found out about the early purple orchid, which was my first orchid all those years ago, was its history as an aphrodisiac. Now, the rather stern-looking chap there on the left is a Greek philosopher, Dioscorides, and writing in AD 65, he he recommended the early purple orchid as an aphrodisiac. The guy in the middle there at the bottom is Nicholas Culpeper, who wrote one of the first mass-produced herbals, effectively an identification guide to the wildflowers that they knew of at the time. He was a bit of a plagiarist, to be perfectly honest. He nicked a lot of his material from some of his contemporaries, but the book was published to widespread acclaim and described the plants that were to be found and also their properties. And this was an important aspect of a herbal, the qualities which those plants could be used for. Culpeper wrote, "The roots are to be used with discretion. They are hot and moist in operation under the dominance of Venus and provoke lust exceedingly." So he wasn't mincing his words. Early purple orchid was hot stuff. Um, that was in 1653. 70 odd years later, the woman on the right-hand side, incredible woman, this Elizabeth Blackwell, she wrote and she illustrated herself with her own drawings and self-published another herbal. Um, and she described the early purple orchid as a stimulus to venery, strengthening the genital parts. So she wasn't quite as saucy as Culpeper. Now, this particular herbal that she had produced, she self-published it, and all of the proceeds were used to pay off the debts of her husband, who was in the debtor's prison. And I'm afraid to say that Alexander, her husband, didn't repay her hard work at all well. He was no sooner freed than he ran off to Sweden, where he joined the royal court. And I'm pretty sure that having abandoned Elizabeth, she was none too disappointed when a few years later he was hanged for treason. So it just goes to show that karma had followed him. Um, and finally, there a contemporary of these people creating these herbals was, of course, the chap at the top there, William Shakespeare. And Shakespeare described the early purple orchid in Hamlet when he was writing about Ophelia's garland, and he described the flowers in there as long purples that liberal shepherds give a grosser name. Now, that was the early purple orchid, but what was the grosser name? Shakespeare was being coy. Well, we don't have to look too far. Just go to the continent where in Italy, the early purple orchid was known at the time as Testicolo di Cane, and in Spain it was known as Collón de Perro, which translates as dog testicles. Um, it was basically the doctrine of signatures, where a plant's appearance was inferred to have some sort of relevance to the properties which it might bring to humans when we were using them in medicine. If you dug up an orchid, it had tubers which looked rather like testicles. And so effectively, the early purple orchid had a reputation as a vegetable Viagra, if you will. It was a really potent aphrodisiac. Now, there is a an English expression which I don't know how well this translates to an American audience, but it's a pretty salty expression where if something is the very best of its kind, it's known as the dog's bollocks. And I have always assumed that that particular expression comes from the continental name for the early purple orchid, the Testicolo di Cane or Goyon de Perro. I'm assuming that that must have been a similar etymology. Now then, my first orchid, though, in 2016, when I was dashing around the country to look for Britain's wild orchids, wasn't an early purple orchid. I expected it would be, and that's what I was looking for. And I got a text message from one of my network of orchid hunting friends upon whom I would be relying that year for up-to-date sightings. And the message simply said, Sawfly is out. And this was a complete surprise. 2 years previously, in 2014, an orchid hunter and his wife had been looking for early spider orchids on the Dorset coast in the south of England. And they had stumbled across an Ophrys bee orchid of an entirely unexpected species, a Mediterranean species, Ophrys tenthreadinifera, the sawfly orchid. Um, the news of this was broken a few months later when a copy of BSBI News, which is a plant journal in the UK, that thumped onto doorsteps, and on the front cover was a picture of a magnificent sawfly orchid, the one which this husband and wife team had found. It had 4 or 5 flowers. It was a really fine example of its kind. And in the article which accompanied the discovery, the finder speculated that this must have blown as seed from the Mediterranean to the Dorset coast where it had landed, and it had germinated and become this orchid in the fullness of time. And this is a really enticing theory because orchid seed is dust fine, of course. And the theory goes that it gets caught up in the winds which sometimes blow from the Sahara in North Africa across southern Europe and deposit Saharan dust on the windscreens of cars and people's windows and so on across southern England. It's an enticing theory. It's an attractive one. It's a romantic notion, but it's very hard to prove whether it actually brings orchid seed to Britain. And I think if it did, we'd probably have seen more examples of Mediterranean orchids turning up. Um, Personally, I think this was planted. If you have a look on eBay in Europe, from kind of this time of year onwards, from March onwards, especially some of the continental equivalents or versions of eBay, you'll find vendors selling orchid tubers. It's illegal, but nobody's policing this, and people can actually buy orchid tubers. They go from anything from 15 euros to a couple of €100 for the really unusual, spectacular species. So I think someone had bought this sawfly orchid as a tuber and had planted it on the Dorset coast for what reasons unknown, making mischief maybe to see whether it would grow. Who knows? And the finder and his wife were the unwitting recipients of a practical joke. We'll never know for sure. However, it turns out, as I started to dig into this story and try to do my due diligence, that this was far from the first Mediterranean orchid to actually turn up on the Dorset coast. Um, on the right-hand side, you can see a page from a herbarium. This it shows an orchid called Ophrys bertolonii. This is an Italian Ophrys bee orchid, which in 1976 was found just a few miles away from where that sawfly orchid was in 2016. Um, at the time the news broke, a photographer from London rushed down and took these images. And a few days later, the orchid was gone. A great mystery. The rumor had it that one of the local botanists at the time was disgusted that someone had planted this thing here and had dug it up. In the fullness of time, an alternative story appeared that it hadn't actually been planted, but a woman from a village a few miles away had gone on holiday to southern Europe and had brought back orchid seed, and she'd cast it around, and that was how this had come to be there. Again, we'll never know. Um, However, when I was doing my digging, digging for stories, that is, I should say. When I was doing my digging for stories, I also discovered that a titan of 20th century British literature, John Fowles, who wrote, amongst other novels, The French Lieutenant's Woman, He lived in Dorset at the time in the 1970s, and throughout his lifetime, he was a strident champion of the natural world. He was a very vocal critic of anyone who took anything from the natural world. He wrote a searching essay called "The Tree," in which he described collectors of wild things as he said, "Collection is the death of the living," which I think is a fair comment. It was only when he died and his diaries were published posthumously that we discover that Fowles actually protested a little too much. He went on holiday regularly to France and to Greece, and when he did so, he would dig up wild orchids and he would bring them back to his home in Dorset, just a few miles along the coast from where those two orchids were found, one in 1976 and one in 2016. And he brought these orchid tubers back to his Dorset garden and he planted them there and tried to naturalize them, some with some success. The orchid you see on the lower left there is the woodcock orchid, Ophrys scolopax, which was naturalized successfully in his garden and was growing there and flowering every year quite happily until his death. Um, and there's a wonderful extract from his diary which describes exactly how blatant this was. In May 1973, he records on his return from France, this is a quote, "A moment of horror at the customs as I realized we're to be searched by a sharp-eyed lady officer with 4 boxes of orchids and other illicit roots to be found. But she seems content with charging duty, £15 on 36 bottles on the wine." So a bit of a rogue John Fowles. Now, those are Mediterranean Ophrys species which have no place being in Britain, but they are some of my favorite genus of European orchids. And we do have 4 species which are native in Britain, and these were particular jewels during my Orchid Summer search. Now, the orchid which you see on the left there is early spider orchid, Ophrys sphygiodes. And this is the orchid which grows on the south coast of England, from Dorset right the way across to Kent. It's found all across the coast along that stretch of a couple of 100 miles, I guess. It's a reasonably commonplace orchid in the right habitat. But the orchid on the right-hand side is late spider orchid, Ophrys fuciflora, and that is a European species which is right on the edge of its European range and found only in one county, Kent, in the very southeastern corner of England. And this is the county where you can look across the Straits of Dover and literally see France in the distance over the water. So it's as close to Europe as it could possibly be. Um, and it's never been recorded outside of, or not reliably outside of Kent. And even in Kent, it's only found at a handful of stations. Now, a reason for that may not only be climate and the calcareous growing conditions which it requires, but also its pollinator, because the Ophrys bee orchids famously are pollinated by insects which are normally more or less unique to that particular orchid. So early spider orchid, for example, is pollinated by mining bees, Andrena mining bees, as is late spider orchid, a different species, a long-horned and a mining bee with very long antennae, which is achingly rare in Kent. So the lack of a pollinator may be what's inhibiting the late spider orchid from much chance of spreading. Now, there are 2 other Ophrys orchids which are also found in Britain, and both of them are much more widespread than those 2. The left one on the left is the bee orchid Ophrys apifera, and the one on the right is the fly orchid Ophrys insectivora. Now, the fly orchid also has a specific pollinator. In this instance, it's a digger wasp, which we'll come to in just a second. The bee orchid, though, we need to get that out of the way. That is fully autogamous. The pollinia, which you can see on the lower flower, the yellow pollen bundles dangling there on a newly opened flower. They're hanging there, but within a day or two, they flip back, and the orchid flower is self-pollinated. It doesn't require an insect to intervene. The fly orchid, on the other hand, this digger wasp, this was one of the first orchids which the pollination by an insect and the specific sort of insect being related to the specific orchid was noticed and described by none other than Charles Darwin, the father of the concept of evolution. And Darwin, at his home in Kent, at a place called Down Bank, was looking at fly orchids. And at the time, they were known as the fly orchid for a good reason. If you look at them visually, they do look rather like an insect. You've got the lateral petals are reduced to those thin filiform appearance, rather like an insect's antennae. There's a pair of glossy black pseudo eyes up there by the stigmatic cavity. The speculum, the shiny area on the middle of the labellum, the that's kind of iridescent and shiny. If you were a passing insect, that might look a little bit like insect wings. And the body of the labellum is kind of furry and dark and elongated. So there's a pretty good approximation of an insect there. Darwin saw all of this, and he saw these digger wasps making a regular visit to the orchid where they would attempt to copulate with the flower, something called pseudocopulation. And Darwin quite correctly realized that the plants had evolved alongside the digger wasp to use the digger wasp as their specific pollinator, as exact and precise a relationship as a lock and a key. What Darwin didn't realize, but now we know, is that he was not only correct, but the extent of the evolution was more marvelous even than he could imagine, because the fly orchids give off a scent which mimics the pheromone released by a virgin female digger wasp when she hatches and she takes to the wing. She gives off a scent to attract male digger wasps. Well, the orchids have hacked the system. They've created a scent which approximates that. And so a passing male digger wasp will smell that scent, look down, and he'll see what looks pretty much like a female insect. And what's more, that shiny speculum on the body of the orchid, on the labellum, if you see that as an insect, as a digger wasp sees it in the ultraviolet spectrum, it really fluoresces. It's iridescent, just like an insect's wings. So the deception is better than Darwin could even have realized. And the image there on the right-hand side is a fly orchid being pollinated in the act of pseudocopulation by a digger wasp. This was something which one of my wildlife tour leading colleagues, Dr. Richard Bate, and I saw during one of our orchid tours last year in Kent. It's a fantastic thing to see. Maddeningly, I didn't have my camera with me, but Richard did, so that's his image. It's a wonderful picture. On the left there, that's a mining bee on a Anopheris sphagodes, an early spider orchid type, and you can actually see that bee has got the pollinia stuck on its head there. And so this is what happens. One of these insects lands, attempts to mate with the orchid, obviously rather an unsatisfying process, flies off, and with any luck, it'll be lured to another orchid flower by the same deception. And at this point, the pollinia, which is stuck on its head, will stick to the orchid and pollination will ensue. Now, back to that bee orchid that we mentioned a moment ago, sometimes the insects get it wrong. And you get where you've got a colony of bee orchids and fly orchids approximate to one another, you sometimes get a hybrid. And this is one such in the middle there. You've got the bee orchid on the left, you've got the fly orchid on the right. And in between, you've got Ophrys expecii, I think, or piecii. My pronunciation's dreadful, but it's the hybrid offspring of bee and fly orchid. It's, as a lot of you will well know with orchid hybrids, Sometimes they'll favor one parent or the other, but often it's a bit like mixing paint. You'll take black paint and white paint, mix it together, you get something in the middle, a grey. And that's what you've got here with that hybrid. You've got shades of both parents. You've got the elongated body of the fly orchid, but it's a little more tapered and attenuated. Rather like the bottom of the bee orchid is rounded rather than bifurcated. The sepals, instead of being the lime green of the fly orchid or the rich pink of the bee orchid, they're kind of a muddy grayish pink, somewhere in between. Um, so yes, this was one of the first hybrid orchids I saw during my orchid summer, and an obsession with finding hybrids was born in that moment. This was something completely novel. Um, those hybrids, though, those bee fly orchid hybrids are sterile. Effectively, it's an evolutionary dead end. But once we get into the dactyloriza orchids, they are capable of creating fertile hybrids, which is the route of speciation for a number of the dactyloriza found across Europe and in Britain, and Ireland, that's no exception. And what you've got here are effectively your mother and father for a number of species that I would go on to see in Britain and Ireland. On the left, that's common spotted orchid, Dactylorhiza fuchsii. And on the right, early marsh orchid, which is Dactylorhiza incarnata. Now, incarnata comes in a number of subspecies, variations, color forms, which seem to be fairly habitat specific. There's 4 or 5 which are found in Britain, and they vary in color from a ochraluca, which is a rich, creamy white with hints of yellow, through to Coccinea, which is a blood red version of it. The one here on the screen is the nominate subspecies incarnata, which is kind of a flesh-colored flower. And the point of telling you about all of these different color iterations is that at various points in the past, these have cross-pollinated with common spotted orchid, and hybrid young have been produced. And what's happening with these hybrid young is chromosome doubling. They've got twice the normal set of chromosomes. It's a process called, here we go, this is a tough word to say at 2 o'clock in the morning, allopolyploidy. There we go. I think I've managed to get that out. What that effectively means, though, is that those offspring are viable. They may show some preference for their own kind rather than for their parents. Although, as anyone who has spent any time looking at dactylorhiza orchids can tell you, they're perfectly capable of introgressing back towards either of the parents over generations. But at various points in the past, this process of crossing has happened, and different iterations of hybrid have formed and have started to breed within themselves and have settled into what came to be viable and valid species in and of their own right. A number of those are found in Britain and Ireland. The 3 British ones, specifically British only, are from left to right. Southern marsh orchid, northern marsh orchid, and Pugsley's marsh orchid. As you can see, they're all pretty different looking things. Sure, they're all purple orchids, but they have very different forms. And they have kind of different geographic. They've carved up Britain effectively into different geographic zones. Southern marsh orchid is found in southern England, up through Wales, and up into the sort of the southern bit of northern England, where it hands over to northern marsh orchid, which is found in North Wales, northern England, and up through Scotland. Pugsley's marsh orchid is found sort of north of a diagonal line which bisects southwest England up to northeast England. It's found north of that. Um, Pugsley's marsh orchid, I have some history with. It would have been brilliant had I done this during my orchid summer travels, but fate wasn't to let that happen. In 2017, I found Pugsley's marsh orchid here in the Shetland Islands, which was the first ever record of its kind for Shetland. Subsequently, a couple of other botanists based up here have found other examples of it. So I think it's a cryptic species which had gone overlooked for a great many years. It's also found in Ireland, and in Ireland they have their own marsh orchid, the Irish marsh orchid, Dactylorhiza keriensis, which was formed of a hybrid coupling at some point in the past with early marsh orchid and a different spotted orchid, heath spotted orchid, which gives it a slightly different form. But that meant I had to travel out to Ireland to see that as well in the course of my travels. So these are orchids which have each got themselves a niche across Britain and Ireland, but some of our native orchids are rather like the late spider orchid, which we were looking at a few slides ago, are continental species which are found right on the edge of their European range in southern England. From left to right here, that's military orchid, Orchis militaris. In the middle, lady orchid, Orchis purpurea. And on the right-hand side, monkey orchid, Orchis simia. The names are reasonably self-explanatory. They kind of have humanoid features in the flowers. The lady orchid's perhaps the most obvious one. It does look rather like a lady in a dress. The monkey orchid has got some sort of semblance of a capering monkey. It's got little arms and legs. And the military orchid is said to resemble, it certainly resembles a humanoid figure, but the helmet is said to resemble the helmets worn by the Roundheads during the English Civil War. Um, Military orchid found at three sites in Britain, some in the Cotswolds just outside of London, and some in Suffolk, but just at those sites and nowhere else. Lady orchid is found a little more extensively. Its heartland is Kent, again in the southeast of England, the very southern and most eastern, southeasternmost county of England. But it has started to spread its range a little bit out of there up into Surrey. There have been records from as far west as Wiltshire, which is kind of halfway across the bottom of England. Um, Monkey orchid, known from just two or three sites, one in Oxfordshire and two in Kent. And it's interesting, monkey orchid, because it's one of the earliest examples of what we would now call rewilding. I'm not sure if this is a concept which has got much traction in the States, but in Europe it's becoming quite the thing at the moment, where people are intervening to attempt to put species back into the countryside where once they were before intensive agriculture or persecution got rid of them in the past century or so. And in the 1950s, monkey orchid was known from only one site in Kent in the north of the county, and a local botanist and orchid enthusiast, a guy called Hector Wilkes, thought that this was a very vulnerable site, and if it was wiped out, because it was kind of surrounded by farmland, the monkey orchids would be gone. So he took matters into his own hands. He didn't talk to anyone about this, he just did it. And he collected seed capsules from the monkey orchids and he took them to, I think it was seven sites across the county in Kent, which he thought looked good for monkey orchid. And he scattered the seed in these sites. And at one of those sites, the seed did actually germinate. It found the correct mycorrhizal fungal host in the soil, which the orchid seed, terrestrial orchid seed, needs to once it's germinated, actually to form a symbiosis with, to form a protocorm, and in the fullness of time, an orchid tuber, which is sufficient to create a flowering plant. By sheer luck, one of those sites had that mycorrhizal fungus in the soil, and the monkey orchids germinated and started to flower there. And that's now probably the best site in Britain to actually see these things. There's, in a good year, several hundred plants flowering there to this day. And the particular valley has actually ended up becoming a nature reserve, and it's named after Hector. It's the Hector Wilkes Reserve. So that's rather wonderful. Um, Now, we only have one Cypripedium native to Britain. It's the lady's slipper, Cypripedium calceolus. And that, by the early 20th century, was believed to be extinct. it had been collected to extinction, literally dug up to be sold to be planted in people's gardens, which a lot of the time would be a death sentence for the plants. Um, Writing in 1790, Smith and Sowerby created a book called English Botany, and it was kind of a much more technical and beautiful version of the early herbals we were talking about that Culpeper and Blackwell had written a couple of centuries beforehand. And the Lady Slipper Orchid was the first plate as you open the cover of this magnificent folio work. And Smith and Sowerby wrote, if the beauty or scarcity of a plant or the singularity of its structure entitle it to our notice, the lady's slipper certainly merits first place in a work on British plants. It may indeed be reckoned the queen of all the European orchids. Accordingly, it has not only been cherished by the scientific botanist, but it has amongst gardeners always sold at the highest price of any British vegetable. I don't know. It doesn't look much like a vegetable to me. That's no cabbage. That is an absolutely gorgeous orchid. But the beauty was its downfall. It was collected furiously, sold, and as I say, by the early 20th century, it was believed to be extinct. Then I think it was in the 1930s, a father and son, the Jarmans, discovered in Yorkshire, up in the north of England, which had been the Lady Slipper's heartland in the past. They discovered a flowering plant. Nowadays, that would be huge news. It would be splashed all over social media. Back then, they feared for the plant's safety, and so they kept it quiet. And over the decades which followed, a small number of people were brought within the secret and were aware of it, but the plant's location was kept a top secret. At various points, though, news started to leak out, and attacks effectively were made on the plant by plant collectors. This still is a thing to even to this day. Orchid, some people are so obsessed with orchids they want to dig them up and have them in their gardens. Um, the plant itself was spreading vegetatively, which Lady Slipper Orchid will do. And so it formed, it wasn't just one plant, it was quite a patch. And so it survived these various attacks in the 60s and 70s. But it felt like the writing was on the wall, and it was just the one plant. And so Kew, the sort of the seat of botanical science in Britain, decided that something needed to be done. And in the early 80s, they started a program to work out how to asymbiotically germinate orchid seeds. So without using the fungal partner, which normally they need in the soil to germinate successfully. And Q worked out how to do this, and they started to grow the lady slipper orchid, flasking it and creating small seedlings. Initially, they were just using seed from that one plant in Yorkshire. But in the fullness of time, they came across a couple of further plants in private hands in the north of England. These were thought to be plants which had been dug in the 19th century and had persisted in private gardens. And so they were able to use pollen from these donor plants with the parent plant in or the mother plant in Yorkshire. And funnily enough, rather than just being self-pollinated, the resultant offspring were much stronger than the original self-pollinated ones. And they started to plant these out by the early 90s, and they worked out that planting out very young tender plants didn't work very well. Slugs and snails were consuming them, voles, rodents were attacking them. And so this is kind of basic gardening stuff. They worked out that larger, more mature plants would naturalize more readily. And by the time I was doing my Orchid Summer and I saw this particular plant in the photo here, um, the program was considered to be a success. This was rewilding at its best. I think it was at 14 sites or thereabouts in the north of England. They planted this out in their hundreds. They'd successfully naturalized, and the first examples of seed set were being seen, natural wild seed set. So it looked like a success. That was in 2016. If you fast forward to today and go to those sites, the lady slipper has vanished from most of them. What's happened? Well, it's been dug up, not by plant collectors, but by the team behind the reintroduction, because they've subsequently looked at the DNA of the parent plants, and they've realized that the ones in private hands, the pollen parents, weren't all British plants. Some had continental DNA in them. And so they've taken a really purist approach and they've removed any plants which are known to now have this mixed DNA. And I think that's kind of daft because we've got something which is functionally extinct in Britain anyway. And there's a reason why I've got a butterfly and a bird here on this slide because there are perfectly good examples of other rewilding initiatives which have taken place in Britain in the past 40, 50 years, which have involved continental stock to bring something back. On the left, the large blue butterfly, Fengaris arian, was extirpated as a British species by 1979, and scientists and conservationists bought Swedish large blue butterflies. And once they'd got the ground conditions correct for a reintroduction, they reintroduced them. They're now found across their entire former historical range. It's a conservation success story, but it ain't British large blues, it's Swedish ones, but that's okay. Red kite, the bird on the right, is perhaps an even more pertinent example because by the early 1980s, there was a tiny population of red kites left in Britain, in central Wales, in mid Wales. So they were still here, but they weren't spreading at all. They were showing no signs of doing so. And so conservationists bought red kites from Spain. They released them in southern England initially and then further up into northern England and in Scotland. Nowadays, it's almost impossible to drive anywhere in England or parts of Scotland without seeing red kites overhead. It's been a resounding success story. And they've met up with those original Welsh red kites and now form one meta population across much of Britain. So successful now that those kites are actually being taken, some of them back to Spain to supplant the Spanish population, which is in trouble. But that's continental DNA that's flying around in Britain, but that's okay. So why do we have to be so purist about the orchids? I think they should have left them there. But anyway, that's just me. Um, and besides, actually, looking at this slide, orchids don't recognize national boundaries. So since I was doing my Orchid Summer travels, we've now got three different Serapia's tongue orchid species which have turned up in Britain. So this is kind of an update on what I was seeing. I didn't see these while I was doing my travels. On the left, we've got small flowered tongue orchid, that's Serapias parviflora. There was one historic record from Cornwall in the southwest of England, which was possibly blown there as windblown seed from northern France. Who knows? But a few years ago, that was found growing in its dozens on the roof, on a green roof of a bank, Nomura, in the city of London, in the heart of London. Um, how that got there again, people have said, oh, maybe it blew in a seed, but I mean that green roof was sedum matting was planted there, and it seems more likely that the small flowered tongue orchids came with as imported seed or seedlings in that sedum matting. They're incredibly happy up there on the roof of Nomura, and being a bank, it's got great security. There's no orchid collectors going to get at those. Last year, I believe there were over 1,000 plants present on the roof of Nomura. Greater tongue orchid in the middle there, Serapias lingua. Again, there's a historic record of that from the southwest of England, which was found in Devon in the 1980s and persisted for a number of years. Just basically a single clump of them, and then vanished. That again was speculated that might have blown there. A few years ago, a colony, however, was found in the southeast of England in Essex, growing on a former strawberry field, which had become a ruderal field. It was returning to nature. And yeah, a colony of these were found there. They probably came accidentally with imported strawberry plants, but again, that romantic notion, people have said, oh, they must have blown in as seed. Well, maybe, but there seems like a more plausible human intervention behind their presence there. The last one is on the right-hand side is the most recent, and this is plowshare tongue orchid, Serapius vomeracea. And this is a really interesting one because you can kind of see the mechanism by which that's arrived. Because if you drive through France or other parts of Europe, but in particular in France, you'll see this on the sides of the motorways and the main highways in France. And it's a pretty tough tongue orchid. It's quite a big thing. It's tall and sturdy, and it's capable of growing in quite rank grassland, i.e., like on the side of a motorway or a highway, and it can compete with the grass in that circumstance. And it's at the side of the roads, and it seems like the seed is caught in the slipstream of passing traffic and pulled along the verges, and that's how it's spreading. Either that or it's getting caught up in the silt that's sticking to vehicles and drying and then dropping off and moving the seed around the country. And it's working its way north. And just a handful of years ago, a couple of these plants were found on the side of a motorway in Kent, again, this southeasternmost county of England, just outside Maidstone. And this is an arterial route from the Channel Tunnel in Folkestone and the Channel Port of Dover, both of which are on the south coast of Kent. This is about 25 miles north of there. If I was a betting man, I would say that that had arrived there either as caught up as probably as silt on a passing vehicle that had come from the continent. If I was a betting man, I'd say there's probably more of that growing along the motorway down there in Kent. But none of us go botanizing on the sides of a motorway because it's illegal to walk around there for one thing. But these things don't recognize borders. They've turned up under their own steam. So I don't think we should be too precious about orchid purity with the lady's slipper. Um, since I wrote Orchid Summer, taxonomists have been at work, and well, in fact, one of them was already one of these two orchids was already removed as a valid species. The other one has been downgraded since I wrote Orchid Summer. These are effectively Robinson Crusoe orchids. So these are taxa, let's say, that's a good word. These are taxa which are found on islands off of the coast of Scotland and England, respectively. The one on the left is Hebridean marsh orchid, which was known for a number of years as a valid species. The DNA, at a molecular level, had been looked at, and they said, yeah, it's a valid species. And that was something known as Dactylorhiza ebudensis. Then in the early part of the current century, it was looked at again in more detail, and it was downgraded to a variety of a subspecies of Pugsley's marsh orchid, which we saw earlier, that very spindly looking thing, which I discovered up on Shetland. Um, and so it's lost its full species status. It's now the full name. This is like a party trick being able to say this is Dactylorhiza tronsteineroides, subspecies Francis drusei, variety ebudensis. It's a complete mouthful for a very pretty little orchid. It's only found on two islands off of the coast of Scotland in the Hebrides, North Uist and Berneray, which are two islands side by side. Um, that's not a valid species anymore, nor is the one on the right-hand side, which is Lindisfarne helleborine, which when I saw it in 2016 was still considered a valid species. It's now again had its DNA looked at, and they've said no, the taxonomists, it's not sufficiently divergent enough to maintain its species status. That's found, as the name suggests, on the island of Lindisfarne, or sometimes known as Holy Island, off the English northeast coast of Northumberland. Um, if I know anything about orchid taxonomy, and I'm no scientist, so I don't know much. I would say that there wasn't a firm inky line drawn under any of these things. They may yet get reappraised in the fullness of time. We'll see. Um, but while I was on the Hebrides, we come back to hybrids again. I do love a hybrid. And while I was looking for Hebridean marsh orchid, I found this gorgeous thing in the center of the screen there. And this is a hybrid between the Dactylorhiza on the left, frog orchid, Dactylorhiza viridis, and northern marsh orchid on the right, Dactylorhiza purpurea, purpurella, rather. I beg your pardon. And it's a bit like my early purple orchid at the start of this story. When I saw this hybrid, I knew exactly what it was. It looked so much different to both of the parents, but it shared properties of both. It had the elongated labellum of a frog orchid rather than the sort of diamond-shaped labellum of a northern marsh. It was bigger, it was taller, it had some hybrid vigor. It doesn't come out terribly well in this photo. I found two plants, and one of them in particular had the yellow tones, which you kind of get with the labellum of a frog orchid, which you can see on the very lowermost flower on the frog orchid image there. So I knew what it was. I did a little Snoopy happy dance. Those of you who've been orchid hunting with me in Europe will have seen the John happy dance. When I find something really exciting, I get caught up in the moment. Um, and this was kind of the beginning of me really falling down the orchid rabbit hole. I can see my computer is wanting to die here. Excuse me, I'm just going to plug this in. The battery's going in the middle of the night. Um, I fell down the rabbit hole and started to look for varieties as well as hybrids. It wasn't enough to see every single orchid species in Britain and Ireland that summer. I wanted to see the weirdos, the oddities, find as many hybrids as possible. And so I showed this particular slide to give you an example of the Ophrys bee orchids and how wonderfully varied they can be. They at the top there, left to right, you've got three. You've got fly orchid, bee orchid, and late spider orchid, all of which have dispensed with the usual colours and are just reduced to these gorgeous Varclarantha, I think it's called. But basically, it's a green and white confection. It's beautiful. And then there's another variety, bicolor, which is quite regularly found in, well, rarely, but regularly found in the Ophrys orchids, where the normal lip markings are basically split into a 50-50 bicolor thing. Shows best in the middle at the bottom with the bee orchid. But it's also I've found it in late spider orchid on the right hand side. And last year, because I never stop, I was out looking for variations in early spider orchid last year, and I found the first record I'm aware of the bicolor early spider orchid in England. So it's very exciting. Um, and I show this really slide just to kind of to cue me up for the final flourish of this little exploration of Britain and Ireland's orchids. Sometimes all of the color, or more or less all of the color, is lost. These are two of the orchids we saw earlier in the presentation: lady orchid, Orchis purpurea on the right, left, and early purple orchid on the right. I just love these things, and I show this for no reason other than just the pure aesthetics. I just think they're absolutely gorgeous. However, they are kind of ghost-like, and that sets me up rather crudely for a segue into the final species, the ghost orchid, Epipogium aphyllum. Now, this was always going to be a problem for me. Seeing this, it had been declared extirpated in 2009 as a British species, having not been seen, I think, since 1987. So they'd given it over 20 years, hadn't been seen, and so Plant Life was sort of the kind of the plant conservation charity in the UK and Europe more widely announced that it was gone. Um, Unfortunately, unknown to them, an orchid enthusiast had actually found one a week before they made this press release in 2009, which rather ruined their thunder. But nonetheless, it was still good news. You know, it was still out there. But since 2009, it hadn't been seen since. So by 2016, 7 years later, I didn't know if I was going to find one, but by golly, I was going to give it a good go. And so from late summer through to late autumn, every weekend I was out searching the woodlands which it had been seen in the past, hoping I would get lucky. In the event, I didn't. Um, I'm just showing these three photos here because after I published Orchid Summer, I had people write to say, I really enjoyed your book. By the way, Ghost Orchid, I saw that in the 1970s or I saw that in the 1980s. And so they sent these wonderful archive pictures and I love them, particularly the one in the middle. Chris Balkin sent me this. And you've got three guys, you can just about make out the Ghost Orchid in front of them. And they're obviously delighted. Well, I would have been delighted if I'd found one too, but I didn't. Spoiler alert if you've not read the book. So I had to see a ghost orchid. So what was an orchid hunter to do? Well, I went and saw the very first ghost orchid which was ever found in Britain. And this was found in 1854 in Herefordshire, so in the sort of west of England, butting up against Wales, Herefordshire. And it was found and in a precedent which was to be followed over the years, it was no sooner found than it was picked and pressed rather badly. As you can see, the close up there doesn't really look like a gorgeous ghost orchid. It looks like a squashed sultana peeled off of the seat of a car. Um, but this is to this day preserved in the Cambridge University Herbarium. So I went and saw this, and the manager of the herbarium, wonderful woman, Christine Bartram, was stood and she showed me this and said, there it is. That's the first ever ghost orchid. But don't worry, I know it looks a bit rubbish, but we've got a far better specimen I can show you from the 1950s. And she unfolded the envelope which this specimen was preserved in and opened it up, and there was nothing there. And Christine gasped, and the expression, the blood drained from her face, it really did. She went white as a sheet. And she said, well, that's impossible. It can't have fallen out because, it's in a proper herbarium storage envelope. Someone must have taken it. And it's extraordinary to me to think that orchid hunters, some of them are so obsessed, they would actually take a dead specimen of a flower from a herbarium, but there it was. I mean, I'm afraid to say that as a writer, a little bit of me inside was doing the happy dance because I was just thinking, oh my God, this is going to be fantastic for the book. But it was awful to discover that the theft had taken place of a bit of Britain's plant heritage. And there the story kind of ended. It hadn't been seen since 2009 until 2024. And I showed you that wonderful picture that Dr. Richard Bate had taken of a fly orchid being pollinated by a digger wasp. Richard, I met him first in 2016 when I was doing my Orchid Summer research, and we've become firm friends. I think he possesses the sharpest orchid hunting eyes of anyone I've ever met. And he was determined that one day he would find a ghost orchid. And if anyone was going to do it, I put my money on Richard. And in 2024, he did. He found a ghost orchid in an English woodland in the south of England. I can't say any more. I don't know exactly where it was because he's not told me, and I wouldn't like to ask him because that site has got to be kept secret because the volume of people that would descend on it to look for the ghost orchid, perhaps trampling, compacting the woodland floor, maybe damaging plants that are unseen beneath the leaf litter. It's not an acceptable risk to take. But this is a final note of good news to end upon. They are still out there. And I know that Richard is working with the scientists at Kew who are examining the site, looking at the mycorrhiza and the fungi in the soil, trying to work out what is so special about that site that the ghost orchid has persisted there and to try and replicate those conditions at other sites where it was formerly known. Um, time has been against us this evening. I would have loved to have gone through every single species with you that I saw during my orchid summer, but I just don't have time. So here they are. That's your 50 something species. Um, it's a colorful lot. I love them. I've subsequently spread my wings much wider and I go orchid hunting all over Europe. I have my own little wildlife tour company called Mariposa Nature Tours, and I have a really great team of orchid hunters who join me to lead tours from Greece through Italy, in France, close to home here in the UK. And we're still adding new locations. We were in Tenerife in the Canary Islands in January of this year. Some of you were there with me. And yeah, if you would like to travel with me, there's our website. Come orchid hunting with me and find some exciting things. Thank you ever so much for joining me this evening. If anyone's got any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Unmute us.
Okay.
At this point, yeah, if you have a question for Jon, please make sure your mic is unmuted and ask away.
Paul Catling here. I have a quick question, and it has to do with the story of the white-fronted goose and the transport of the seeds of
Yes,
Spiranthes Roman Zophiana. Oh, you enjoy this story, Jon.
I
Clearly.
do.
Yeah. Well, what do you think of that story? And its proponent, I guess, is Frank Horseman, is it?
Yeah, I mean
Anyway,
it's a bit like the windblown seed. It's an incredibly attractive, romantic explanation for Roman Zoffiana. I don't think the evidence totally stacks up though, because it's been found in the past not only in Ireland and the west coast of Scotland, which are places which white-fronted geese do turn up, granted, but it's also been known from Dartmoor, which is in Devon in the southwest of England, which really there's no way white-fronted geese were going to bring Roman Zophiana's seed there. And also more recently in Wales, a reserve called Kenfig. Um, I don't think that's the vector that they've come here from. I do believe they're probably a relic population from thousands of years, countless thousands of years ago, rather than something which has made it across the Atlantic. And certainly not, I'm not going to subscribe to the windblown seed theory, even though the prevailing wind, heaven knows, I know here is coming from the west. I want it to be true. Let's say that, Paul. I want it to be true. A bit like Fox Mulder in the X-Files, but I want to believe. I'm not sure I do.
thank you. So
Other
I
questions for,
have another question.
go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, I have another question, and that has to do with the dactylorhiza, et cetera,
Hmm.
ebudensis or hebridensis, as it was once called. The habitat, the mesher or whatever it is
That's right.
correctly called, is widespread on the Hebrides, and it's only on those two islands and only
Hmm.
on a part of those two islands.
That's
So,
correct.
why is that when the habitat is much more widespread and it's only known from, I don't know what it is, probably an area of about 10 or 20 square kilometers?
That's right.
I'm guessing.
No,
Yeah.
you're right. You're absolutely right. The maca is it's a wonderful habitat, and if anyone ever has the time and opportunity to visit the Hebrides, I do recommend you do it in the summer because it's incredibly calcareous. If anyone's not familiar with maca, it's effectively shell sand, or rather, it's soil that's very shell sand rich. So it's incredibly good habitat for orchids and other wildflowers besides. And so if you visit in the summer, it's a carpet of orchids if you get your timing right. Um, and that's where you've got a lot of different species of orchid growing cheek by jowl. It's a brilliant opportunity for hybridization to take place. And that's what appears to have happened here at some point in the past to create, um, well, as I say, a variety of Pugsley's marsh orchids. So it's a variety of a subspecies of that. Why is it so limited? I suspect because that historic hybrid event happened in that location. Um, is this the beginning? Are we perhaps seeing the beginning of a valid species? I I think that's a plausible explanation. Um, but I am no scientist, and I haven't been peeping at a molecular level at these things, and I defer to my elders and betters in that regard. They're adamant now that it is not a species; it's merely a variety of a subspecies, and I have to defer to that. Um, I think whatever historic event took place in that vicinity, and it simply hasn't spread from there. Why it hasn't spread any further, maybe in terms of plant time, it's just not been long enough for it to do so.
Thank you very much. And I enjoyed your presentation very much, John.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. Thank you for joining me.
Any other questions for Jon? If not, then thank you, Jon. Again, the program has been recorded and we'll be posting it on the NOC website in fairly short order, so you can watch it again at your leisure. Um, I will have one closing remark before I bid everyone good evening. A month from now, on Tuesday, March 24th, this will be our final Zoom program of the spring season. The title is Revolutionizing Species Identification, and it relates to a multi-million-dollar project by the Missouri Botanical Garden to digitize their entire collection of more than 6 million plants using AI to develop a database of plant features and traits. The idea being that this will be public information and possibly other herbaria will be able to use their data, the MOBOT database, to identify hitherto unknown specimens in their own collections. That's a very layman's summary thumbnail sketch of what the program will be. We have a speaker substitution. The curator or director of the herbarium, Jordan Teicher, will be giving the program. We'll have an update on the web very shortly with a bio and his picture. And hopefully we'll see everyone in a month on Tuesday, March 24th. So again, thank you, Jon, for your program. I hope the coffee was sufficient to tide you through. Thanks everyone for coming tonight, and we'll see you in a month. And good evening, everyone, and goodbye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.